Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review for July 5, 2026. Hovik, should I wish you a happy Constitution Day under the current circumstances?
What a cruel joke, yes. July 5 was Armenian Constitution Day, and the Kangaroo Court, or whatever it's is to be called, issued their verdict one day before that. A clear, trashing of the Constitution, if there ever was in Armenia. But we'll talk more about that later today.
So it's one of our topics.
Let's get going.
Yeah. But first, folks, thanks for listening to our show. Your confidence in us rewards our dedication to bring you intelligent and independent coverage of Armenian news. There are no corporate or government shills here, no political associations, just the two of us, Hovik and me, our honest and informed beliefs, and that's it, our mics. Please consider supporting us. Go to podcast.groong.org, and ideally you would become a sustaining supporter. We can really use your help. Thank you. Let's get on with the show. Hovik, take the first topic today.
Okay, so the Armenian Constitutional Court. We had talked about this in episode 563, the previous episode to this one with Zunit Aghajanyan, about the aftermath of the elections. There was a limbo period where the Constitutional Court held, the obligatory hearings, but that didn't change any of the results that we all feared. On July 4th, Armenia's Constitutional Court ruled to uphold the results of the election and essentially deprive Prosperous Armenia of its votes. And specifically in the form of invalidating the results from 3 precincts, which were a majority support for Prosperous Armenia, and thereby cutting the votes for Prosperous Armenia by a few hundred votes, which was just enough to put them under the 4% threshold.
Yeah, 1.5 million people voted, and 200 votes short to kick them out of the parliament.
I always try to stop myself from being too ranty, but this is, it's plain to everyone's eyes how this happened, and it poses a very tough, choice for the opposition, which we'll talk about. But as a result of this, what I would say many in the opposition consider unconstitutional theft of the elections, Civil Contract will have 64 seats in the parliament, giving them exactly the 3 additional parliamentary seats they need in order to achieve 3/5 majority in parliament. And they will essentially not need any help from the opposition in lawmaking. They have a carte blanche in most laws they want to pass. They also gave 1 additional seat to Strong Armenia and Armenia Alliance each, putting the combined parliamentary opposition at 41 seats. That's just 1 seat short of the power to block the government from, making critical appointments like the human rights ombudsperson and other constitutional appointments. We can talk about the Supreme Judicial Council, the Prosecutor General. There are certain constitutional positions that are defined in the Constitution that require a 3/5 majority. At the same time, the regime can now pass any constitutional law. Constitutional laws are different than the Constitution itself. Many changes in the Constitution can happen with 3/5 majority, but some portions of the Constitution require 2/3, which so far the government doesn't, the regime doesn't have. And that is basically going to be the sticking point. It seems like July 2nd was the last session of the previous sitting of the National Assembly. So, my fear was that they would rule for elections now because they had 2/3 majority already. But and by elections, I mean the constitutional referendum. So that is the key point, sticking point that the ruling regime doesn't have, and I believe that they will continue to strive for by now the persecutions against the opposition that we're seeing. So with Zunit Aghajanyan, basically we discussed whether the 3/5 majority might give Civil Contract enough power to actually make changes to the Constitution itself. I honestly don't see a direct way, but other than changing some constitutional laws to be more in their favor.
Hovik, do you think that there is enough opposition power in the parliament to stop eroding Armenia's sovereignty through further concessions to Azerbaijan?
It's not like the Pashinyan regime had any constitutional approval to do all of the previous concessions that it has done, including, for instance, the handing off of the Goris-Kapan highway, which is part of Armenia, to Azerbaijan without any, basically Armenia's constitution mandates that any transfer of land be done through referendum. So if the Armenian government ever wants to formalize the transfer of land and transfer of territories, which it already has de facto given to Azerbaijan, a lot of them, it would require the ratification through a referendum at least, if everything was done by law. And I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I ascertain from watching the media. And so the only thing that the regime currently lacks is a two-thirds constitutional majority. And what the constitutional majority would be useful for is changing the constitution, parts of the constitution itself that are the parliament is able to change, and also authorizing constitutional referendum. Now, I don't know, we talked with Zunik, and I don't know if she says that the government can still find a way to do that through changing the laws here and there. I think one thing that the government has already started to do in preparation for a referendum is to reduce the list of voters directly in the face of Armenian law, which guarantees all citizens the right to vote, regardless of their residency status. Now they say that if you are going to be absent from Armenia for 6 months, then you will lose the right to vote. And that is, we know who that is targeted at, and that is directly targeted at maybe, Armenians who travel back and forth to Russia, either for migrant work or for other purposes. It's easier to travel to outside of Armenia for a longer period, closer to Armenia, closer to the region than the United States, for instance. But that is the situation now. But at least by the letter of the law, the Pashinyan regime currently lacks the constitutional majority. So it remains to be seen how they will go forward with a referendum. I still see that maybe sometime in the future, after banning the opposition parties, or maybe they will authorize a new election by Pashinyan resigning twice, and they will then try to have a new election to get the constitutional majority they need. Or the other option that the Pashinyan regime will now have, I think, is to coerce, through compromat, through threats, through jailing, continue jailing of the opposition leaders, to coerce some of the members of the opposition parties to join their side, and to, at least for some important issues such as a vote on a constitutional referendum. I believe they need a handful of votes, maybe less than 6, to go from a 3/5 majority to a 2/3 majority.
Right. They have 64 right now, as you mentioned, and they need 69 votes, I believe, to form a 2/3 majority. Hovik, one of the things that was up in the air until actually today was whether the opposition, well, Strong Armenia and Armenia Alliance, were going to pick up their mandates in the parliament. What happened there?
So both Armenia Alliance and Strong Armenia announced that they will take up their mandates. They issued a lengthy, I think both parties issued justification for their decision. And essentially, they are framing it that the being in the parliament will give them more chances to continue the fight. And both, I believe, mentioned that this needs to be coupled with a street movement that will come at an opportune time. Now, when we talk about a street movement, it can happen in two ways. It can happen in the way that Pashinyan came to power, which was through paralyzing the government and forcing the regime to resign at the time, which led to fresh elections. Or after 1 year, because the Armenian law requires a 1 year period after, if Pashinyan is elected, if the new prime minister is elected, there can be no vote.
Like a vote of no confidence?
There will be no vote of confidence during the first year.
So do you think that at present, the opposition, and when I say opposition, it's those two parties, right, that got into parliament, Strong Armenia and Armenia Alliance. Do you think that the opposition actually decided that it's better to work through the legislative system, taking up their mandates in parliament, and that street action was not a viable option? Why is that?
Well, I think that street action alone is not viable, and I can only speculate because we don't know all the details. But at the same time, I defer to the leaders of the opposition because they're the only opposition we have. So they must know something we don't. But I think that any change of government in Armenia, just like it had happened in 2018, will require not foreign support, but at least foreign acquiescence, right? So my thinking is that if there is a revolution through the streets, then there will need to be recognition of those results by friendly countries, including Russia, because the first thing that will happen is EU and the West will rule for sanctions against Armenia, both on a country level and on the level of the United Nations. So Armenia needs someone who can veto any, at least UN level resolutions. And I believe that regional powers, and mainly I'm talking about Russia at this point, are probably, wary of picking a fight with the West over Armenia at this point in time. Although all the logic dictates that the West's meddling in Armenia is not permanent, or permanent meddling in Armenia and permanent conquest of Armenia by the West is not in the interests of Russia. But I just think that they are prioritizing everything towards Ukraine. And unfortunately, no revolution has happened anywhere without foreign support, or at least foreign acquiescence.
Do you think that with the 41 seats of opposition in the parliament, Moscow feels that they have enough legislative veto over any kind of a peace that Pashinyan could try to sign with Azerbaijan? So essentially, let's say that the 41, they have some kind of confidence that no peace deal will be struck between Pashinyan and Aliyev in the next whatever years, 5 years.
When we're talking currently, Pashinyan's narrative about peace is about complete capitulation to Azerbaijan and Turkey, and thereby any projects backed by those forces and their wider network of backers, including EU and the West. And that includes TRIPP, that includes a complete reorganization of transportation systems and political affiliation. I don't think per se Russia would be against any sort of peace deal, but I don't think that's their primary concern. As long as Russia's interests are accounted for, then Russia should. I don't feel Russia is inherently against peace. And again, as I said, right now it is not going to be peace. It is going to be capitulation and continued concessions by Armenia to Azerbaijan, Turkey, and the West. To answer your question more directly, I mean, Russia, I don't think looks at elections in terms of how many seats it had, and I don't consider the 41 seats that are 41 seats that got allocated to the opposition are considered so-called Russian seats. There are many voices in the opposition that are not blanket pro-Russian, but Russia's interests need to be accounted for, and as long as Armenia is going against them, then they're playing with fire, thereby also harming Armenia in the future, which is my main concern.
Now, Samvel Karapetyan proposed last week that the country's leading opposition forces must set up some kind of a, he called, coordinating council that would discuss and take joint action against the Pashinyan government. He said he expects to meet these other leaders and finalize some kind of an arrangement after the Constitutional Court ruling, which happened over the weekend. What do you expect? Do you expect anything? Are these talks going on?
Out of the interests of survival of the opposition, those talks must happen. I can't guess as to the nature of the talks. I don't think anything has been public, but I think the opposition will have some coordination. They must have this coordination. But it seems like at least in the forthcoming period, in the let's say next 6 months, the opposition will take their seats and will try to uh, regroup towards the upcoming battle. Like we said, I think, like I said, I don't believe that the entire opposition is subdued. I think that the fight continues. It's just that it will, the timing of the next battle will be carefully planned, and I think that may come around the time of when Pashinyan, who has indicated already he will hand over Tigranashen, which is right in the middle of north-south communication on the uh, western side of Armenia, and also the two so-called enclaves on the eastern side of Armenia as well, that Pashinyan has indicated that he will hand over. The opposition will coordinate its activities around those times. So for now, I think we can expect a tumultuous period. There will be more arrests, and Pashinyan will do everything to chip away at the opposition seats any way they can, including what we're seeing right now, which is Gagik Tsarukyan's persecution, and Samvel
Well, we'll
Karapetyan is
mention
still
those
under
in a
house
moment.
arrest. Yeah.
They're not coming. They've started today, as a matter
Yes.
of fact. Let's take a break from that for just a moment. Let's talk about European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who visited Baku and Yerevan on July 1 and 2 to advance the EU's peace through connectivity agenda, aiming to integrate the region into a transport corridor from Central Asia to Europe. In Baku, she focused on EU energy partnerships and unveiled this 200 million euro global gateway investment package, prominently featuring the Nakhichevan railway network. In Yerevan, she countered Russia's trade embargo on Armenian products by offering something she called autonomous trade measures, proposing to free 80% of Armenia's exports to the EU from EU tariffs and additional financial assistance as well. Now, for me, what was interesting to hear was this 200 million euro funding for a Nakhichevan railway network. I couldn't understand if the EU is trying to fund TRIPP, some of the infrastructure that is being planned for TRIPP, or is this a parallel project? Are the EU and the US actually in sync on who's doing what with transit tracks in the South Caucasus? Or alternately, are we looking at some kind of a quiet intra-Western competition between the US and the EU over the future infrastructure that's going to use also transit through Sunik? Have you heard about this? I mean, this was the first time I had actually heard about the 200 million euro, whether it's a grant or a loan, I don't know quite yet.
I think the EU has made its bet, and I think earlier this year, EU started vocally speaking about TRIPP, and I think the entire East-West communication through Turkey, Nakhichevan,
Hmm.
Sunik, and later Azerbaijan and Central Asia is the core of EU's transportation strategy. And as such, I think that this is in preparation for that. So we're looking at the TRIPP that is only the Armenia part of this middle corridor. But I believe this is basically EU's effort to make that middle corridor robust enough to handle its needs, which is preparing for future war with Russia, preparing for more, offloading of any Russian gas dependencies that the EU has, and energy dependencies, but at the same time, Central
Hovik,
Asian
yeah,
resources.
let me also mention that you and I were actually talking to a nuclear industry expert yesterday, and he was mentioning that the majority of the uranium being extracted these days is from Kazakhstan. And we've heard a lot about natural resource extraction in a lot of the deals that are being, even the one for TRIPP with Sunik had a component of natural resources between the US and Armenia. So this middle
Yeah.
corridor that some people also call the Panturanic corridor, some people also call the Zangezur corridor, it doesn't matter what you call it. The deal is that they're trying to extend all the way from Europe to the soft underbelly of Russia, all the way to Kazakhstan, Central Asia, to make sure that they have access to all those resources instead of just Russia. And also, Russia should be preparing for war, to be honest.
Yeah, so this is an outright attempt to take over Russia, take over Russian influence in the Central Asian region, which I think is more concerning to Russia than Armenia, because Central Asia has become more important. Actually, I would say not for as much for the US, but for the EU, because if you remember 2 years ago, France lost mm, access to nuclear energy markets from Africa. Multiple countries kicked France out of their country in
Hmm.
Africa. So France made an immediate pivot, and I believe that was also one of the considerations that led to Macron essentially influencing Pashinyan or forcing Pashinyan or coercing Pashinyan to um, announce that that Artsakh is not a part of Armenia. So I believe this strategy is more important to EU than anyone else. And mainly, I mean, it's not just about nuclear, but nuclear, material and uranium, and is going to be very important for EU in the future. So this is the lifeline that the EU is building. And as you mentioned, our friend did mention that currently, even in the US, most of the US produced nuclear material and enriched nuclear material is only allocated for federal or military use. So
Right.
civilian power plants, civilian nuclear reactors are forced to look for other sources of obtaining the material, especially the enriched material. And I believe that Central Asia is going to be really important for that as well. So US plus EU are building that lifeline. And it's not just about nuclear, but also gas and energy, which I think those are also more important for the EU than the US.
Well, so in Baku, von der Leyen praised Aliyev for promoting peace and cooperation. And I know, Hovik, that you would expect von der Leyen to also say something about human rights concerns in Baku. And that includes, of course, Armenian POWs still held in Baku, the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, the destruction of Armenian monuments, Christian churches, and heritage. But did she do any of that? There was none of that. So what's interesting is that this peace and cooperation that she's praising Aliyev about 6 years ago, if we were to go back, there were a lot of complaints, documented complaints from all quarters of Europe in the middle of the 44-day war. But all of that is now gone, and it's peace and prosperity. At the same time, in Yerevan, the West is backing Pashinyan's government, despite the fact that there is a huge and ramping authoritarianism going on. The stolen elections, post-election arrests, we will talk just a little bit about that. It's kind of crazy what's going on in Armenia, but they're absolutely oblivious to any of these things.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I don't really have a question. I'm just ranting as usual that the EU is prioritizing transit corridors for their own energy resilience above all else, especially Armenia's security. It is such a disposable commodity for them. It makes me sick.
And I think that's an understatement because it's really tough to be an Armenian nowadays and to be concerned about Armenia's security and see all of this happening around us. Essentially, we're being trampled over. And I would say Armenians consider themselves one of the more democratic countries in the region, but democracy has lost its meaning completely. Freedom has
Completely.
lost its meaning completely. We are being sold at a slave market at the cheapest price possible to satisfy European desires. And many would say that has been Europe's modus operandi for all the last 500 years. And any illusion about affinity with the West. Yes, Armenia had a lot of cultural affinity. Armenia has a lot of affinity to the values of Europeans, at least the ones that were published in books, in literature. But all of that needs to go out the door because we're living in a new world, and it is freaking tough to be an Armenian right now and to maintain a straight face. And that is haunting us, I'm sure, most Armenians. And
Hovik, von der Leyen said, "You can count on us." That's a direct quote. She said to Armenia, "You can count on us." Let me be 100% clear. If war breaks out involving Armenia, Armenia is going to get stomped. And there's not a damn thing that Ursula von der Leyen can do, or the EU can do, or even the United States can do to help Armenia. There's not a
let me
thing.
tell you, let me go more. If Ilham Aliyev kills off 99% of the Armenians, EU will thank Ilham Aliyev
Peace and prosperity.
for saving that 1%, for the museum. EU will praise Aliyev to be, for peace and cooperation, and it is sickening. But we're discussing this with a straight face. I don't know how to convey those emotions without breaking down, but at the same time, it reinforces that Armenia must build up its own strength and not count on anyone, to save them, but it should build up allies. And I think that there is some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of Russia being freed from future Ukraine, military pressures, as well as Iran, resurgent Iran, and those are our natural allies. Like it or not, if the alternative is going to be a servitude, a 1,000-year servitude to Turkey and Azerbaijan, and as a maximum as a province of Azerbaijan under Aliyev's rule, not even Turkey's, because Turkey even probably wouldn't, Erdogan wouldn't care about Armenia as much as Aliyev would. So that is my emotional, probably, assessment of where things are. But also, I think that there's a segment of pragmatism, that I think that we all need to take into account. We all feel insulted by the various geopolitical realities around us, but to be insulted and then to commit suicide just to spite Russia, or just to spite those powers that we thought would come and save us on a white horse, I think that's the wrong idea to have about Armenia right now. And to talk about the bailouts, right? So EU is waiving customs fees on 80% of Armenian exports. We talked about this, for perishable goods. Armenia has no reliable way of economically sending them to the EU. It's going to take 2 months to send any fruit, any vegetables, and some of, especially flowers, for instance. Armenia for whatever reason, Armenia has decided to invest in the flower industry. Flowers are the worst type of thing you can invest in, because let's say if you can't export fish, at least you can reprocess them and make them into canned fish, right? And sell them. You can make prunes out of apricots, but for flowers, which is huge in Armenia for whatever reason, that it also talks about how short-sighted Armenia's investment strategy and development strategy has been in the last 8 years under this regime. That we're not prioritizing industries that are more resilient to export issues.
Well, there's a lack of ramping up alternative markets. If Pashinyan, for example, really just wants to pivot, doesn't want to have anything to do with Russia, this is ignoring the fact that Russia is the biggest consumer of Armenian products. And it's going to take years to ramp up the markets that are resilient, that are dedicated to Armenian products. And none of that has happened. So the only alternative I see right now is that, let's say these products are not going to make it to the market, they're going to die. The only way that you're going to keep these farmers or other businessmen in business, it's going to be bailouts. And we're seeing that already. The $34 million that immediately was sent to Armenia as an emergency it was essentially a bailout. Okay, that's great. But for how long? How long can you do that?
And these are not free. This is not free money. This is not even,
That's
financial
right. For
aid.
Armenian
It's
citizens,
loans.
your children are going to be paying for it.
Yeah.
Your next generation is going to
And
be paying for it.
and even if it comes in the form of aid, that means your hands are, more commitments, more concessions to the EU for whatever projects. And I think that, we talked about this last time, but I don't want to, more political favors to the EU against Russia. So whether it's in support of Ukraine and whatnot. So Armenia has no clear vision of where to go, and it is completely now being dictated. Its policies are being dictated by the EU and Turkey and Azerbaijan. All right, so let's move on. Now that the Constitutional Court has issued its verdict, the next day at 7:25 a.m., hundreds of National Security Service officials armed with machine guns and other deadly weaponry stormed various businesses and the homes belonging to Gagik Tsarukyan. He was arrested. Over 70 sites were simultaneously raided. And it was a spectacle. If you can think about the number of people who would be involved in such an operation.
And Hovik, let's emphasize, these are
Yeah,
masked automatic rifle and machine gun people, SWAT teams.
yeah. I want to emphasize there are reports that Armenians in some positions, in some border positions, are not even allowed to, they need to be strip searched by Azerbaijan to go to their position, or somehow they need to be approved to go. But all of Armenia's military might is being turned against the opposition. So 2,000 agents, I think as a conservative estimate, were mobilized to do this operation against Gagik Tsarukyan. And that's double the amount that Russia used to do the Chechen terrorist operations. So when there was a Chechen terrorist operation in Moscow.
And these are supposed to be, I was trying to say that, Hovik, these are white collar crimes. These are not terroristic operations.
I haven't seen a single site where, Gagik Tsarukyan had any illegal arms or was offering any resistance. So it was all like, they were allowed complete entry, but just for the spectacle of it, just to parade them in front of the media, they use, theater like
SWAT
this
teams.
to scare people. Yeah. And of course, that is not the end. Ser Sarkisyan is now being threatened. His bank accounts, his assets are raided. It was also announced that there are fresh allegations of vote buying against Hayastan Dashing, and more suspects were arrested. None of these have ever reached the court verdict, and many of these have been cases where the suspects were later released. But it's all this show is continuing, and most Western media, again, I want to underscore this. Most Western media are playing along with Pashinyan and trying to present this as some kind of a objective, he said, she said thing, and we need to give it time. And that includes media funded by the West in Armenia.
So is this going to be live for the next 5 years?
I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I'm terrified by it.
Yeah.
Just from the perspective of doing a podcast every week that talks about this bullshit week after week just terrifies me.
Yeah, I think we are all concerned, but I think that this can't last forever. This kind of repression can't last forever. Once geopolitical realities change a little bit, there's a shift. We will see Pashinyan's regime crumble. The only issue is, yes, how long it will take and how many people will suffer, how many people will lose their freedom in the meanwhile while taking part in this struggle. And to be honest, for many Armenians, and I normally live in Armenia. I'm currently in the US, but I'm concerned, of course, about my own freedom as well. I know many friends who are now in jail. Sadly, the life of someone who doesn't agree with Pashinyan is maybe it's an honor actually to know these people, but maybe we're next. Maybe we will also be targeted, but to me, that's a fight worth having. And to many Armenians, I think that this is a fight that you can't give up. So the only issue is when and how it will start to boil over.
Yeah. Well, Hovik, Pashinyan himself was in Russia today, and he was there to formally attend an EAEU Industry Policy Council conference in Yekaterinburg. And for the past 2 weeks, Pashinyan has been trying to call Putin, but no dice. He hasn't been picking up the phone. So he finally called up Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, who met with him today, as a matter of fact. The Russians said that they expect the post-election government of Armenia to develop ties with Russia and maintain friendly and neighborly relations beneficial for both sides. And there was news that Russia again proposed to build the next Armenian nuclear power plant. Now, this news itself was not directly correlated to any of the visit or anything like that, but I found it interesting that on the same day, the news surfaces again and gains some currency. So, in my mind, there's some kind of an association. The Armenian side said there is no desire to exit the EAEU, the Eurasian Economic Union, and wanted to develop ties to get past the recent issues, which was kind of interesting to hear that there's an admission on the part of Pashinyan that there are issues between Russia and Armenia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I read from the visit. Did you pick up anything from that visit?
A few things. So Putin is still holding off his recognition or congratulations to Pashinyan on his election. But I think that will eventually come. And the sign that Mishustin is meeting with Pashinyan is an indication that, yes, that will eventually come. But I think the next term that Pashinyan holds will contain a lot of tension, more tension between Armenia and Russia. And Pashinyan will, on one hand, be coerced by EU to have more anti-Russian stances. Meanwhile, out of self-survival, he will probably try to see how we can accommodate Russia. And if there is any accommodation to Russian interests, it will be at Russia, at Armenia, at the cost of Armenian interests. So more Armenian sovereignty. I'm not sure how that will take shape, but the EU clearly is on a war footing with Russia. So I don't see how this is resolved, other than Pashinyan giving more concessions, more promises to Russians. If Russia accepts any of these promises, I don't think they will take them at face value, but they might work to delay some of the decisions and forthcoming sort of policy moves by Pashinyan that are going to be more outright pro-European. Thinking more about the internal civil Armenian regime kitchen. I don't know how interesting it is to me, but I think we should mention it that the Civil Contract Party is already picking who its top leadership is going to be, both in parliament, various appointments. And the most visible element of that in Armenian media was this Rubinyan versus Simonyan affair, right? Alen Simonyan is currently the head of the Armenian parliament, the speaker of the parliament. And there's indication that he was expecting to keep his seat, but the Civil Contract Party voted to appoint Rubinyan as the next parliament speaker. And Alen Simonyan was clearly shocked. He said that he would continue to support Pashinyan, but he would leave politics. There was also some news that he might be in line for the next president of Armenia, which is a figurehead position, because
I think he declined that. He said he was
yeah,
not interested in that. Yeah.
yeah. So and Rubinyan's appointment is interesting because Rubinyan was the key person in negotiations between Armenia and Turkey. We talked about his questionable past from previously when he was a student at Turkey, but it's clear that he has strong support from the Erdogan regime, and this may have been essentially a concession to Turkey and more direct Turkish influence in Armenia. Meanwhile, I think that still many see Alen Simonyan as an aide or an ally of Pashinyan.
So Hovik, when the media asked Pashinyan about this, Pashinyan said the decision by the Civil Contract Party was a surprise to him, so he didn't really know what the next steps were. I'm not sure how much I'm buying the fact that he doesn't know. If he didn't know, and there are a lot of analysts who actually believe that these were the demand to get Rubinyan on board was an external demand, like Turkey wanted Rubinyan. Do you think that Pashinyan's Turkish and Azeri allies actually blindsided him and came up with this request and he didn't know about it? Or is he bullshitting and he actually knew about it, but he's just saying, yeah, it was a surprise to him.
Um, Well, it's clear that the only reason that Pashinyan is in power today is because of Turkey and Azerbaijan. So I think they do have influence. Now, maybe he was blindsided. I don't know. I don't think Pashinyan by himself can maintain totalitarian rule. So the power for his rule comes from Turkey, Azerbaijan, EU, and the West. Now, how those forces decided that Rubinyan should be the next parliament speaker is, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Pashinyan was blindsided or if he unwillingly, agreed to this. But yeah, it doesn't matter. I think in the end, it's like he's part of he's a vassal and he will do what he's told externally. That's
Okay,
my thought.
well, yeah. Well, I'm a little surprised when you started the segment, you said that maybe you weren't that interested in it. Frankly, I was interested in hearing all this. I was thinking that Groong should offer to host a cage match between Rubinyan and Simonyan. What do you
You
think
mentioned
about
the
that idea?
um, look. I don't know which one is worse. Alen Simonyan is known for ordering his bodyguards to hold, ordinary passersby who called him a traitor, hold the hands and spit on them. I don't know if Rubinyan, he looks a little bit like a llama, so he may have that spitting instinct still in him, but maybe it'll be like a spitting match between Alen Simonyan and Rubinyan. I don't know, especially with that beard. I don't know. That is his nickname. I cannot take any official of this regime seriously, but I think Rubinyan doesn't have that brash behavior that Alan Simonian has, but I think he'll be expected to rule the parliament with an iron fist. So there will be more repressions of the Armenian opposition in the parliament. But Alan Simonian had a way of doing it that he didn't care about it. He didn't care when he was called a camel because of his spitting. I don't know if Rubinyan will be that resilient to insults or criticism. So we'll see. It's important to note that many of these people, including Rubinyan, I believe, they didn't even have a job prior to coming to
That's
power. I
that's
mean,
right.
their resume reads as I was born, and when I turned 18 or whatever, when I finished my education, I am now a leader of Armenia. What is to be expected from people like this, Asbed? I don't know. It's a farce. It's part of the Armenian tragedy that we're living through.
They're not the only people.
Yeah.
Okay, Hovik, for the final segment, I think we should talk about this issue of IMEI hardware devices. We're both technologists, so this is an interesting area. Armenia is moving towards a mandatory nationwide IMEI cell phone registry by 2027. Pashinyan's government argues that massive amounts of hardware is entering the country undocumented, bypassing customs, and that this project that he wants to set off would be a vital tool to crush the billion-drum black market and capture lost tax revenues. Pashinyan defends the initiative as a standard, civilized regulatory practice. But if you look at the world globally, central state-run IMEI registries are completely absent in North America and Western Europe. Where would you say they are present?
I think I read about Turkey, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, and Pakistan as being bright examples of this policy.
It's pretty
Interesting
interesting
company,
company,
right? Yeah.
right? Yeah, absolutely. We wonder where these ideas came from to Pashinyan. So the question that comes up is this genuinely a routine economic cleanup of the shadow economy that Pashinyan is undertaking, or is the timing at a time right now where there are deep regional domestic instabilities in the country, um, that this is indicative of a government that's quietly seeking tighter internal social control? What do you think?
It's obvious to me that this is all intended to make Armenia more of a surveillance state. It's already a widespread surveillance. It already has all the tools of a surveillance state. We saw how opposition is being wiretapped left and right. So this is just to cover the gap of anyone. They want to essentially ensure that anyone, any device that connects to the Armenian telephone company network is registered and they know who it belongs to,
Mhm.
which will make it very easy to target for surveillance purposes. But that comes, I mean, we know that for sure, right? I mean, you can still do encryption and you can still do signal, and at least your communication might be encrypted point to point, but they will know who you're talking to. They will know who owns that communication endpoint. And that is a concern. And more than surveillance, um, the concern is how the Armenian government plans to secure this, because it is a gift to the attackers. We saw how the data belonging to Armenian citizens was compromised during the war, and even before and after the war. Azerbaijan regularly targets, and Armenia's enemies regularly target Armenian data. So if a foreign entity, whether it's a cyber criminal group or if it's a foreign government, they will know exactly which devices to target
Mhm.
based on this data. And knowing the track record for Armenia to secure data belonging to its citizens, it is going to be one of the easiest, one of the lowest hanging fruits for foreign attackers. This reminds me that we should talk to Ruben Muradian, who we've had on our podcast before. He's an expert in cybersecurity. But I heard him speak on Armenian media, and this is his concern as well, not just surveillance itself, but how this is a wealth of information that in the wrong hands it will be used to target Armenian citizens. And you can bet that Azerbaijan is already developing plans, and not just Azerbaijan, but even a mid-size or a country like Azerbaijan can easily do this. Um,
Hovik, some other cybersecurity experts, people like Samvel Mardirosyan, Artur Babian, have also pointed out at the real deficiencies and weak points of this project. I mean, essentially, we are building a data lake here of everybody's digital footprint. So if you were to get access to this data, and it's inevitable, somebody will get access because Armenia is not that good at cybersecurity at present, at least not the government. Um, you will know who is exactly where and how they got there and their entire trajectory. And
yeah.
just imagine
And
if this
from
falls into enemy hands.
And from a legal perspective, legal analysts have also criticized this law for not being specific enough. For instance, I believe it talks about first of all, the registry is going to be managed by a private corporation. So, what kind of an auditing requirement are you going to have? What kind of security requirements are you going to put forth in front of this corporation to ensure that they hold up all the privacy and security guarantees? And the law also has some, what do you call it, vague wording in it that this company could also provide some other services to the government, and it's not specified what other services. So I'm pretty sure that the government is already building in capabilities to have real-time access to this data through this company. And I'm pretty sure which companies are going to be involved. Maybe we'll know soon, but it's the same companies that, for instance, yeah, I'll stop there, but it'll be companies that are very close to the Pashinyan regime as well.
Well, Hovik, you are very nice in not saying anything. But the cynic in me was thinking maybe just outsource it to Baikar Aerospace Industries. Then you cut out the middleman so that the drones know exactly where you are at all times to target whoever they don't like.
And this is, I mean, even if you had goodwill, right, towards this type of policy, I mean, knowing that the entire government is in the hands of foreign entities, it's very difficult to trust even something that might be legitimate. But this policy is illegitimate. And we should say, to be fair, you know what the Armenian government's justification for this was?
No, well,
That
I
this
mean,
is they're implementing this law to be compliant with EAEU standards.
Eurasian Economic. Okay, well, that's ridiculous. Look, Hovik, a lot of people may be lost in the details of something like this because they feel like, oh, this is technology jargon. I don't understand. Let's just make sure my Facebook app is working. Um, if your phone is lost, for example, you just call your telco carrier and you say, my phone's gone, help me. Can we recover it? If we can't recover it, then what can we do about it? You do something, right? Here, everything is falling in the hands of the government, right?
You
The
have to
government
register
can block
before.
you. Yeah, you have to register with the government. You can be blocked by the government if they decide that you are talking to people that they don't like, saying things that they don't like, posting Facebook posts that they don't like. Okay, all of this is going to be possible for them simply because you are required to register with them. I mean, the issue shows that Armenia's government has become used to turning to these centralized digital control methodologies to solve routine economic problems. And this is fundamentally shifting the power balance between the citizen and the state. For someone like me in the United States, that's just unacceptable.
And our advice to opposition oriented people is don't store anything on your phone that you wouldn't agree to hand over to the Armenian government, especially when entering the country and even when inside the country and you would not like to be listened to, even though you might believe that your conversations are private. Metadata about your conversations is going to be monitored and is already being monitored. I would invest in burner phones. I would invest in more security, and that's why even though I don't have anything to hide, all of my Signal chats have a default expiration. That's a very useful feature that
You can
in
implement that
1 week.
on WhatsApp also,
Yes.
and various other messaging apps. So
Yeah.
look into those things if you are interested.
Expect the Armenian government to be more controlling. A lot of people still sort of assume that communications are, just what do you call it, inert. You're just saying something, but we know that this government is also, taking things out of context, editing recordings, just for the convenience of arresting you, parading you in front of cameras, and maybe they'll release you in a year or so, or maybe they won't. But their interest is to put maximum pressure against the opposition right now.
All right. Let's leave it there for now. I just want to say, Hovik, if I become president of Armenia, I am dismantling the surveillance state. That's going to be job one. All that AWS money that was granted to Armenia, that went to putting together this entire surveillance state. I'm dismantling that stuff. I hope the next
Let me help you do
person in
that as
power
well.
can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be
Okay.
your security czar, and I'll do that.
Thank you for listening to this week in review. I know we're ranting a little bit. It's July 6, 2026. We'll talk to you next week. I'm Asbed Bedrosian.
And I'm Hovik Manocharyan.
Bye-bye.
Keep fighting. Bye.